So one of the things that's really important about disturbances is a biological legacy. It's leaving behind plants, leaving behind organic material, leaving behind stuff that can become the next forest. It can be just organic debris. The standing dead trees are part of the biological legacy of that disturbance. This is a pine beetle-killed stand of I don't remember which pines they were, but basically it killed the overstory. We have standing dead is now a biological legacy, but the seedlings in the foreground are also part of that biological legacy because they're seeds that were left behind from the forest that was there before. We also have soils and fungal mats and bacteria that are part of that legacy as well, because the soil that was part of that forest is still there. Even though all the overstory trees are gone, because the beetle killed them all, the soils are still there that then allow for the establishment of the new forest after it. And so we have stags, we have standing dead, we've got fallen logs, we have fungal mats, we've got the seeds. All of that is part of the biological legacy of the forest that was there before. Fire has moved through here. Definitely changed the composition, the structure, and the function of that forest, but it did not remove the soil. And you can tell it didn't remove the soil because we've got ferns germinating immediately after the fire. We've got some grasses down here. So if there was no soil, there would be nothing able to grow there. And it would take the reformation of that soil before plants could start growing there. But the fact that we have plants growing there immediately after the fire means that the soil is still present. There's fungi, there's bacteria, there's everything underground that makes that soil alive, which is part of the biological legacy of that previous forest. This one's a harvest, but we have this legacy. We've got maple seedlings down below, we've got standing trees, and so the fact that we have trees left behind, we have seedlings left behind, the soil's there, that forest has a biological legacy that it can use to move forward in succession and react to the next forest type. All right. We're going to skip this just because you got it in your notes, but we're running out of time, and there's some other key things I really want to get to before we wrap up. But the idea is that, again, we've got those boundaries on environmental conditions that plants want. There's areas where they're going to grow well, and there's areas where they can't grow because they're outside of their environmental conditions. And basically, as we go through succession, the idea is that the environment changes. And so different plants are going to colonize at different times in succession because it changes over time. The environment changes. And that's the main point of that. Because I want to spend some time on diversity and talk about diversity within forests and within ecosystems and think about the ideas of what that means. So when we're talking about species diversity or diversity within a forest, we're usually thinking about them as diversity of the different species. We can talk about the diversity of genera, of families. We can talk about structural diversity and diversity in layers within that forest. And so if we've got all the same layer, then we have low structure diversity. If we've got multiple layers, we've got higher structural diversity. Again, coming back to our idea of population and species, that each species is able to mate and reproduce with only its own species, so within a population. And each species has a role. It has a niche. It has a place within the community in terms of what it does and what it takes and how it's actually leading to the next community through succession. So we talk about diversity, we're talking about the species, we can talk about it as the phenotype, the physical appearance. And so we can talk about diversity in oaks, because oak trees have really high leaf morphology variation. And so we can talk about the types of leaves that we see within an oak species as part of the diversity. And we can also talk about it, the genotype, which is the genetic makeup of that individual. And if we combine the genotype and the environment, that's how we get the phenotype. So plants that are they're continuously growing, they have the genes to respond to the environment, and that's what gives us what we see. So the branch that forms out from a tree is a response to the environment based on the genes that that tree has in terms of branching. So all of the branches that form on a tree are from both the genes, but also how the environment is influencing the shape of that tree. And again, that plays into the diversity, is how does the structure of that forest change over time based on everything that's happening there. So again, our forest is complex, three-dimensional ecosystem with multiple layers, and the layering is going to give structural diversity, and during succession, structural diversity changes. Because we're going to get growth of trees up, we're going to get the loss of trees from disturbance, we get growth of new trees up, and that change over time is part of that change in structure. So before soil really gets developed, we've got lichens, we'll have mosses and ferns start to add to the soil, then we see grasses, and then shrubs, and then trees developing. We're not going to jump from the development of soil just to trees. We have to go through this structural change over time as succession takes place. So in the sand dunes, when we have that nudation from the storm moving in, the first thing that gets there is not a tree. First thing that gets there are the grasses, or actually are the lichens that then lead to the grasses that lead to the establishment of trees.
So at Fox Island, when they bring in all these saplings in April, that's going to be jumping all that, right? Because they're going to be putting trees.
It's jumping migration. Well, migration is it'll be an artificial migration, and there'll be a ceasus. There'll still be establishing of those seedlings or those saplings, but there is a big jump there that's happening. But again, the soil wasn't removed. The soil already exists there. Trees are going to start coming in naturally. It's just that jump of years from seedling to sapling is going to happen by planting saplings. Yeah. So it's just acceleration to get to the forest. So we can use silvicultural management where we are managing the trees themselves. We can use wildlife management where we're managing for the animals themselves and modify the structure in a way to benefit what we're going for with structure of the trees or the wildlife. All right. This is what I wanted to get to. Okay, here's our forest, right? Again, our artificial forest, because everything's in rows. Trees don't naturally want to grow in straight lines. Species diversity. High or low?
Low.
Okay. Structural diversity.
Low.
Okay. This is also a plantation. Those trees are in lines. Species diversity, high or low?
Medium.
Okay, medium. Structural diversity. Now we have layers. Here we have got one layer. Here we've got some layers.
Yeah.
Saying medium again.
Is
Okay.
that just because the previous one was pine, so the needles kind of,
These are pines as well.
oh, those are?
Yeah, but it's a plantation as well. So it's an artificial forest. All right. Here's where I disappoint you and tell you everybody was wrong. Diversity is a relative measure. There is no such thing as high diversity or low diversity. There's only, in comparison to something else, higher or lower diversity. So the comparison is going to be with another ecosystem or the same ecosystem at a different point in time. So there is no such thing as high or low. It's only relative in comparison to something else. So there is no such thing as high diversity in that second photo or low diversity in the first photo. Without comparison, it makes no sense. It is a unitless measure. It makes no sense. It does not describe the ecosystem without a comparison to something else.
Can you talk about that like, are we saying, if you turned around and looked over here, compared it
Yes.
to right over here?
You can compare it to the next stand
Okay.
in the same forest. You could compare it to a completely different forest in another state, the same state. You could look at like Fox Island. We could measure Fox Island 10 years ago and then measure it now. And that is a comparison then. So that means we can have lower or higher diversity, but it's never going to be high or low. Because a ecosystem naturally and wants to have lower diversity or higher diversity than another, but it doesn't inherently make it bad. So just because we have lower diversity in one forest doesn't mean it's bad naturally. It's just different
And it's only lower because you're comparing it
to something else.
higher.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now we have two plantations here. Which one is higher and which one has a lower species diversity, do you think? So higher might be on the right because you do have some hardwood trees in between the pines. And here we have lower species diversity because it's just the one species of white pine and that's it.
We get only because they're compared to each other.
But only because they're compared to each other.
Otherwise, they're.
I know, it's like, why would you go for the high and the low? Why didn't you just start with the higher and the lower?
I wanted to make you think.
I wasn't saying what's the point of asking us that. I mean, why
No.
would
Yeah, no.
Because he's a college
Why would
professor and gets paid
why
to
would
trick
I
you.
care about that if I were trying to remedy something?
Because again, it goes back to what are we trying to get to as we understand the forest, as we understand succession, what is happening over time? Where is that forest going and what is it becoming? Is it inherently going to become a higher diversity or is it going to go lower because of something we did? Is it going to be lower because of disturbances that are happening? And understanding the disturbances helps us answer where it's going and what type of forest it's going to be and what the community is going to be like.
And maybe it makes us think about what our plans are because we
Exactly.
don't need it to be what we might consider higher diverse.
Right, and that goes back to that idea at the beginning of what are the goals with preserving a forest and conserving a forest? What are we aiming for? How are we defining what we're trying to get to? Are we trying to increase diversity? Are we trying to maintain the natural diversity of that forest? So it really comes down to what we're thinking about in terms of where it's going and what we're trying to get that forest to. Structurally, higher structural diversity, lower structural diversity. We have one layer here. Now, we have a plantation on the right. We have a natural pine grove on the left. Completely different ages. The one on the left is super old. The one on the right is maybe within the last 60 to 70 years that's formed. Now it gets complicated. You're thinking about species diversity. And likely, because that one on the left is super old, it most likely has a higher diversity there. And that's when you have to get down on your hands and knees and start counting plants really closely. It's not an easy snapshot to make. But structurally, which one is higher? The right one has more layers. The one on the left, it's got the understory. It does have some midstory, but it's got a big gap in there of space that's not taken up by plants. So even though the one on the left might have higher species diversity, the one on the right probably has higher structural diversity, more layers forming in the forest.
So there's no correlation.
What's that?
So there's no correlation?
There can be, but yeah, it's not guaranteed relationship between species or structural diversity. And again, it comes back to that idea of what is the forest going to become? What are we trying to push it towards if we're trying to manage it? What are we trying to protect and preserve over time? Here's another one. So dunes on the left, hardwood forest, a kilometer that way. So the soils probably started out as the same sand dunes. Which one has higher species diversity probably? Probably the one on the right. And it also has higher structural diversity. But again, it comes down to what is that forest supposed to be? And in both cases, it's at the point it's supposed to be. Because this is really far away from the dunes, from the lake. So it's not getting disturbed regularly. Has a very infrequent, low scale, low intensity disturbance. Whereas this is getting disturbed every single year with wind from the lake. This is where it's supposed to be within the disturbance that it's getting. This is in the same place. And so just because there's higher species diversity, higher structural diversity in the right, doesn't make that a better forest than the one on the left. But it is, in comparison, higher. So that's the main thing about diversity that I wanted to get across, was the idea that if we're looking at a natural forest, it's going to have the diversity it has. Disturbance is going to alter that. Our actions are going to alter that. Invasive species can alter that. But that gets exaggerated. Even though I'm an ecologist that studies invasive species, that gets really exaggerated. But diversity, again, is only existing in the comparison. Any questions about diversity before we jump into our last topic with invasive species? Yeah.
Which one is better, like with regards to structural diversity? Is it better to have like higher, different layers, or?
Again, it comes down to what should be there. What is the forest that should be there? And so in this case, back away from the dunes, this really dense layering of the forest is supposed to be there. That is not supposed to be out here, because the disturbance that's coming off the lake is changing how that forest develops. If we're talking about songbirds, or we're talking about mammals, then we might see more mammal diversity or more bird diversity with more layers. But if we're looking at Kirtland's warbler, they want that. And so, again, better isn't really the right question. It's which is more, which is less, what is it supposed to get to? Any other questions? All right, so last topic, invasive species. Again, we got to talk about some definitions before we can jump into the discussion. The three main terms that get used in this discussion is exotic, native, and invasive. What's an exotic species?
Not from the area in which it's native.
So not from the area where it's growing. So it's native from someplace else.
It's rare.
Not necessarily rare.
Perhaps. Yeah.
So then if we're using native in that definition, what is a native species then?
Something that was meant to be.
Thrives in the area through all seasons.
It's indigenous. It's from that ecoregion. And so you notice that it's not country, it's not state, it's an ecoregion. Because we have species that are native here that are also native in Canada. And so we have species that are here that are not found in the southwest US. And so they are native to this region, ecological region. They're autochthonous, so they're from here, they're indigenous. They evolved in this location. Exotic is then not indigenous to a given ecoregion. And a really important caveat here in my philosophy, so I subscribe to the philosophy that exotic species exist only through direct or indirect human intervention. So our activities as humans has led to the existence of that species in that ecoregion. So then what is it, an invasive species?
Exotic species
It overtakes, it thrives, what else?
Not indigenous.
Not indigenous,
Competes the natives.
which say outcompetes the natives. So the idea here with invasive is that it increases from rare. So it means that we can introduce, if we move a species and we only move a few of them, and then it increases in numbers, that becomes an invasive species. And it causes some sort of ecological change, so it outcompetes natives. And because this is a human construct, we have to include economics, or it causes economic change due to that increase in numbers. Yeah.
Do you delineate between invasive and aggressive? So aggressive would be something that is native but will overtake your flower bed.
That's
versus-
just succession.
Okay.
So my philosophy, the philosophy that I've subscribed to, is that there is no such thing as an invasive native species. There is no such thing as an aggressive native species.
I would like to.
They
see some
just
natives
have,
flowers.
they are just following succession. They are following that predictable movement of plant communities through time because one community creates an environment that allows for the establishment of the next community. Now, we can have exotic species that are not native, that are invasive. We can have others that are not invasive. They just exist. They're not increasing from rare. They either need human intervention to constantly reproduce, or they disappear. Soybeans, they're exotic, but they're not invasive because they only exist in the field where we plow, and they're not going to colonize the forest because they don't have the capability of doing that. So they're exotic, but they're not invasive.
So invasive, does it mean, or along those lines, it's like invasive, it's like when we can't manage it, or we can't.
It's when it's able to increase in numbers
Yeah,
and
we
spread.
can't- Yeah, and
Yeah,
spread, and we
yeah.
can't manage that.
Or we
That's
can't,
invasive.
yeah, if it doesn't matter if we can stop it or not, but if the plant only exists because we're there, then it's not going to be invasive. Because once we step away and it can't move or it can't increase in numbers, then it can't be invasive. Because it can't spread, it can't reproduce without us. Yeah.
Can you give an example of an economic change?
Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get there. So again, being human intervention, direct or indirect activities, we're moving it from one place to another, and we're facilitating its establishment. Now, after that, it may be able to spread without us. So calorie pair spreads into areas without our help. We may have moved it there originally, but then it starts to reproduce and spreads without any help from us. Kudzu is another great one. So what makes a plant invasive? Again, it has to increase in numbers when rare. So usually it has really successful seed crops. This is Japanese stiltgrass, which is what I studied for my PhD. It has really successful seed crops, super high germination rates. Seeds that it produces are all viable. Exploits the resources. This plant can grow really short in the shade. As soon as it gets opened, a canopy opens, it gets sunlight, it grows 6 feet tall. And it ends up falling over because it doesn't have the ability to stand up 6 feet, and it spreads out very quickly. So it exploits that light resource when it becomes available. And it has limited need for repair. What does that mean? What kind of damage do plants get? So herbivores and disease. But oftentimes when a plant gets moved, it no longer has herbivores or it no longer has diseases, so it doesn't have to repair itself, so it can put all its energy into seed production and reproduction and growth. So it doesn't have to repair anything. So oftentimes the ability to increase from rare is related to available resources, lots of seeds produced, and no herbivores feeding on it. Ecological change, competing with neighbors, so basically subverting the growth of native plants, altering succession, changing the disturbance regime, so changing fire, changing how gaps form in the forest because they're killing off mature trees because they're an insect that's feeding. All those things are invasive species kind of changing the ecology. Economic change is easy to measure. Ecological change is not easy to measure. How do we measure economic change? Dollar signs. We can put a dollar sign on it, we can measure it. How do we measure ecological change? With succession, how do we know what's the next thing that's supposed to happen? So it becomes really difficult to measure. Even though we have ideas of what's going on, they're very hard to measure. So the economic impacts, we always have a dollar sign associated with it. And it always comes back to our utilization of the resource. So if we're looking at tree growth and we have kudzu growing over it, we may measure how many trees have we lost with dollar signs, so we're losing board feet of harvestable trees. If we've got livestock in a field, we can measure how much, how slow their weight gain is and relate that to economic loss. So again, it could be timber yield, it could be animal growth in a field, whether that's cattle or sheep or whatever. The remote stopped working now. One of the invasive plants I worked on for my master's out west has really clear impact on sheep growth and yield. And so the economic values are all tied to sheep farms. Whereas in Michigan, there is no economic impact or change. It's all ecological. And so what I was working on was all ecological change related to that invasive species. So it all is going to be location dependent as well. And like I said, ecological impacts are really hard to quantify. They're almost impossible to measure. We have to kind of make up ways to measure them. And there's so many interactions. Again, we go back to this complex three-dimensional structure of a forest and the interactions that exist. It makes it really hard to tease apart what is actually caused by the invasive species and what is caused by something else that naturally or natively occurs there. And so ecological impacts get really muddy and convoluted and hard to quantify and exaggerated sometimes. Whereas economic impacts are really clear and easy to quantify, but they don't get to the intrinsic value that that forest has. And so we get really hard, it gets really hard to argue for management of invasive species when it's something we can't really measure. But we know there's something going on, but we can't even measure it. All right. I know it's a lot of stuff that I went through. But I want to touch on the summary because this is where your questions are coming from for the test. Right?
No.
In the summary. So remember, forest is a complex ecosystem defined by the trees, but created by everything involved in that interaction. Multiple layers, multiple interactions, all connected together in one forest. Most of our forests have come from these mesic sites, mesophyte, so phytic just means plants. So these are kind of that medium water-loving plants. So we have these mixed mesic hardwood forests that developed after glaciation, and then the subsequent soil development after glaciation. Oops. And again, all of our forests came from Kentucky as the glaciers receded. Climate, time, parent material, the organisms, topography, all define the formation of soils that we see And the forest composition is going to be defined by the soils, which is then going to be defined by the forest composition, which is then going to define the soils. So very complicated interactions, creating the soils, but then also creating the tree composition of the forest itself. Succession is transition through time from one plant group to the next. So from one community to the next community over time, and that most of the succession in Indiana is moving towards hardwood forests that are dominated by oaks and hickories and beech and maple. That's the most common set of forests that we're going to see in Indiana as we move through succession. Diversity is defined a bunch of different ways, different levels, from species to structural, and all are important in defining the forest ecosystem. And I didn't put it here, but again, diversity is a relative measure. It's in comparison to something else. And invasive species can impact the native species. They can outcompete and displace natives. They can remove dominant plants. They can alter succession, alter disturbance, and change where that forest is going within its successional process. So it can get to a different forest type because of an invasive species.